Renting a place, whether it's a home or an office, is something so many of us go through. But let's be honest, it can feel like you're trying to figure out a complicated game with no rule book. What are your rights? What are the landlord's responsibilities? What happens when you disagree? It's a relationship that's built on trust, for sure, but it's also supposed to be built on a clear set of laws.
So let's get into it. For anyone renting in Pakistan's Sindh province, that rulebook is the Sindh Rented Premises Ordinance of 1979. In this explainer, we're going to break it all down. First, we'll introduce the rulebook itself. Then, we'll define the key players in this game. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of rent. We'll look at the rights and duties for both sides, tackle the really strict rules around eviction, and finally see how you're supposed to handle any disputes.
So, what exactly is this ordinance? Well, think of it as the foundation for every rental agreement in the urban areas of Sindh since 1979. It's the law that sets the ground rules for everybody, landlords and tenants alike. And that's its mission, right there in the law's own words. It's not meant to pick a side. The whole point is to create a fair, balanced, and predictable system, one that protects the interests of the person who owns the property and the person who's paying to live or work there. Okay, so before we dive into the rules of the game, we've got to know who's actually playing. The law is super specific about this, so let's get these definitions straight. First up, the landlord. Now, you might think this is just the owner of the building, but it's actually a bit broader. The law says it can also be a property manager, or really anyone who's officially allowed to collect the rent for the owner. So if you're dealing with an agent, for all legal purposes, they're the landlord. Next, the tenant. This is pretty straightforward. It's the person paying rent to use the space. But check out that last part, including their legal heirs. That's a huge deal. It means if a tenant passes away, their family members who are in possession of the property can actually inherit the tenancy under the very same agreement. And finally, we have the controller. This person isn't on either team. They're a government official, and their whole job is to be the referee in the world of renting. When there's a dispute, they're the one you go to make sure everyone is playing by the book. All right, next up, let's talk about the heart of any rental agreement, right? The money. The ordinance has some very clear rules about how rent is handled. So, the big question, when is rent actually due? Well, Section 10 of the law sets a default date. Unless your agreement says otherwise, your rent for the month is legally due by the 10th of the next month. Of course, you and your landlord can agree on a different day, but if you don't, the 10th is the cutoff. But what happens if a landlord refuses to take your rent? Maybe as a way to try and evict you for non-payment later. The law has a clear three-step process to protect you. First, you have to try and pay them directly. If they refuse, you send it through a postal money order. And if they still refuse, you deposit the rent with the controller. This creates an undeniable legal record that you tried to pay.
And what about rent increases? This is a big one. The law puts a pretty firm cap on it. A landlord can't increase the rent by more than 10% a year. And here's the other key part. That increase can only happen after 3 years have passed since the rent was last set.
A good rental situation is a two-way street. It's not all on one person, and the ordinance makes this crystal clear by laying out the duties for both the landlord and the tenant. And you can see that balance right here. The landlord has to handle things like major repairs and make sure the basic utilities are running. On the flip side, the tenant's got to pay the rent on time, take care of the place, and not cause problems for the neighbors. It's all about mutual obligation. Now this, right here, is one of the most powerful protections a tenant has. A landlord cannot, I repeat, cannot legally shut off your water, gas, or electricity to try and force you out or make you pay. Doing that is a serious offense under the law and can lead to fines or even jail time.
Okay, let's move on to the most serious topic in any tenancy, eviction. This is obviously a huge deal, and the law is incredibly specific about it. A landlord can't just kick you out. There are very few, very specific reasons they can legally ask you to leave.
This one sentence is basically the tenant's shield. It means a landlord can't just wake up one morning and decide they want you gone. They have to have a legally valid reason that is actually listed in this ordinance, and they have to follow the proper legal process. Random, arbitrary evictions are flat out illegal. So what are those valid reasons? Well, here are some of the main ones. Things like if the tenant is actively damaging the property, or if the whole building needs to be rebuilt. Another major one is if the landlord needs the property for their own family's use, or if the place has been sold and the new owner wants to move in.
Now, here's a really interesting part of the law. Section 14 gives a kind of fast track to certain landlords. If the owner is a widow, an orphan, someone about to retire, or over the age of 60, they have a more direct path. They can simply give 2 months' notice to get their property back for personal use, without having to go through a long, drawn-out case.
So, what happens when the rules get broken and the landlord and tenant just can't see eye to eye? Well, that's when our official referee, the controller, gets involved. The law sets up a formal system for sorting these problems out. And it's really important to know where to go. You don't take these issues to a regular civil court. The controller is the first stop and the main authority for all rental cases. They have powers like a court. They can call witnesses and issue orders that are legally binding. And if you want to appeal the controller's decision, it doesn't go to another lower court, it goes straight to the high court. So, at the end of the day, the Sindh Rented Premises Ordinance of 1979 was built to bring fairness and predictability to the rental market. It lays out clear rules for everything, from paying rent to the process of eviction, all to protect both sides. But that leaves us with a big question to think about. This law is over 40 years old. In today's world, with today's economic realities, does it still strike the right balance for both landlords and tenants?